A 4-year-old boy was inside a house in Geneva, Indiana, when a tree came down on the roof. He didn't survive. That single moment, confirmed by the Jennings County Sheriff's Office, is one small piece of what happened this week across the American Midwest. A stretch of days that meteorologists are now calling something more than just another round of summer storms. Something in the pattern shifted. And for millions of people from Iowa to West Virginia, the threat sitting over their heads right now is not the threat they were bracing for a week ago, and it isn't behaving like anything the region has dealt with in recent memory. To understand why this week matters, you have to understand what 2026 already was before any of this happened. This was already shaping up to be one of the most severe weather years the Midwest has logged in a long time. Go back to March. Over just 3 days, from the 5th to the 7th, a tornado outbreak tore through the Rocky Mountains and into the Central Plains and Midwest, producing 32 confirmed tornadoes, one of them reaching EF3 strength with winds up to 160 miles an hour in Union City, Michigan. 8 people died in that stretch. Barely a week later, an even larger outbreak followed. 106 tornadoes between March 10th and 12th, ripping across the southern, midwestern, and eastern United States, with hail the size of dinner plates reported in Kankakee, Illinois. That alone would have made for an unusual year. Then, April happened. A widespread outbreak on the 17th and 18th produced 86 tornadoes across the central and midwestern United States, one of them an EF3 with winds of 145 miles per hour near Ringgold, Wisconsin. The Storm Prediction Center, the federal government's severe weather forecasting arm under NOAA, had flagged the risk days in advance, warning that Kansas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Missouri all faced an enhanced threat. Days later, on April 23rd, another outbreak sequence began, this time centered on a dry line stretching through Oklahoma and Kansas. By the time spring turned to summer, the numbers were already startling, and then June brought yet another outbreak. 52 tornadoes across Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan on June 11th, 6 of them rated EF2 or stronger. In the Chicago area alone, the National Weather Service office there confirmed 24 tornadoes from that single event, making it the second largest tornado day on record for that office, behind only a 2024 outbreak. The state-level numbers tell the same story from a different angle. According to data from NOAA's Storm Prediction Center, cited by UPI, Illinois broke its own annual tornado record in June of this year, and then broke that new record again by the end of July, reaching 221 preliminary tornado reports for 2026. Indiana, meanwhile, tied and then surpassed a record that had stood since 2011, reaching 79 confirmed tornadoes by the end of July, according to the National Weather Service. Even West Virginia, a state that in most years goes without a single tornado report, had logged 10 preliminary reports by the end of July. None of that is normal. All of it comes from official Storm Prediction Center data, not estimates. Add all of that together, and by the middle of August, the National Weather Service's Chicago office had confirmed 70 tornadoes within its coverage area for the year. That broke the previous full-year record of 63, set in 2024, and it broke it before summer was even over. Meteorologists were already using words like unusually active to describe the season. That's the backdrop. That's the baseline millions of Midwesterners had already adjusted to, uneasily, by the time August arrived. But what happened this week is different in kind, not just in degree. It didn't look like the outbreaks that came before it. There was no single afternoon of rotating supercells marching across open plains. Instead, on August 11th, a long, fast-moving line of thunderstorms formed over Iowa, began traveling east, and it kept traveling hour after hour for hundreds of miles, tearing through northern Illinois into Indiana and on into Ohio and Kentucky. By the time the National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center reviewed the data that evening, they confirmed what many meteorologists suspected in real time. This was a derecho. And according to reporting from HNGN citing the Storm Prediction Center, it was the region's first derecho in 6 years. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, a derecho is not a tornado, and it is not just a bad thunderstorm. To officially qualify, a storm complex has to travel at least 250 miles while producing a continuous swath of wind damage, with gusts reaching at least 58 miles per hour somewhere along that path. This storm blew past that threshold. Wind gusts reached 99 miles per hour in Gary, Indiana, hurricane strength, recorded not out at sea but over a Midwestern city street. Across the wider Chicago metro area, gusts of 80 to 90 miles per hour were reported at multiple personal weather stations. The storm's path stretched more than 600 miles from where it began in Iowa to where it finally weakened near the Ohio and Kentucky border. Derechos don't just knock down a few trees and move on. They move fast, they move far, and they hit almost everyone along their track at nearly the same time, which is part of why the damage adds up so quickly. As the storm crossed into the Chicago suburbs, it also spun up tornadoes. At least 2, and possibly 3, touched down south of the city, including one along the Cook-Will County border and another near Mokina. Farther west in Iowa, 3 additional tornadoes were confirmed, rated EF1. All of this happened within roughly the same 24-hour window, which is precisely what separates a derecho event from an ordinary line of storms. According to the Associated Press, at least 2 tornadoes touched down across Illinois and Iowa that day, with meteorologists expecting more to be confirmed once survey teams could safely assess the damage. By early Wednesday morning, the human cost of the storm was becoming clear, and it kept climbing through the day. In Portage, Indiana, a house exploded during the storm, killing 1 person. Neighbors told local media they had just stepped outside to look at storm damage when the blast occurred. As of this reporting, officials were still investigating whether the severe weather played a direct role in that explosion. It has not been fully confirmed, and different outlets have described it differently, so treat that connection as still under review rather than settled fact. In Geneva, Indiana, within Jennings County, the 4-year-old boy died when a falling tree struck the home he was in, according to the sheriff's office there. In Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine confirmed that a resident of Roseville died during a medical emergency after first responders were unable to reach them in time because the roads were flooded. Reporting from the Watchers, a severe weather tracking outlet, cited at least 2 confirmed deaths as of the early morning of August 12th, while later Associated Press and HNGN reporting put the toll at 4 as more information came in through Wednesday. That gap between early and later numbers isn't a contradiction. It's simply how storm death tolls are usually confirmed, county by county, as officials verify each case. So take the current number, at least 4, as the most current confirmed figure, understanding it may still rise. Then there's the power grid. By Wednesday morning, more than 700,000 customers were without electricity across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, according to poweroutage.us data cited in multiple reports. Some figures climbed even higher through the day, with the Watchers reporting more than 800,000 customers without power at one point overnight. Utility crews were still working Wednesday afternoon to clear downed trees and snapped power lines, a process that in a storm of this size can take days rather than hours. Even Chicago's air travel wasn't spared. Both of the city's major airports briefly halted all flights as the storm passed through, with officials warning travelers to expect delays as the backlog cleared. On the ground, the scenes were the kind that stick with people. In Tinley Park, one of Chicago's suburbs, a resident named Carrie Horrigan stood outside the house she'd lived in for 25 years and described what was left of it in 3 words, reported by the Associated Press: total devastation. No roof. A few miles away in Homewood, another Chicago suburb, 54-year-old Javid Jenkins told Weather.com he'd been out searching for gas to keep a generator running so his family's food wouldn't spoil, while tornado sirens wailed overhead. He put what so many Midwesterners were feeling into a single line: this region is built to handle snow, built to handle cold, not this. That sentiment, that this doesn't fit the pattern people are used to, is worth sitting with for a second, because it's really the core of why this week has forecasters and officials using different language than they did even a month ago. The Midwest has a well-worn seasonal rhythm in most people's minds: tornado outbreaks in spring, humid but manageable summers, ice and snow in winter. What actually unfolded over the past several days doesn't fit neatly into any single box. It's not simply a tornado outbreak. It's not simply a flood event. It's not simply a heat wave. It's the layering of at least 3 distinct severe weather threats: wind, water, and heat, arriving in overlapping waves across the same stretch of the country within the same 72-hour window. While Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio were dealing with derecho damage, flooding was becoming its own separate crisis just to the south and west. Perry County, Ohio, recorded 5 to 8 inches of rain, according to the Watchers' analysis of the event, enough to flood structures, vehicles, and roads throughout the county. Governor DeWine declared a state of emergency for Perry and Muskingum counties and activated a National Guard high water rescue unit to reach residents trapped by the rising water, telling reporters he expected additional counties to be added to the declaration as the situation continued to unfold. A flash flood emergency in Perry County, one of the National Weather Service's most urgent flood alerts reserved for situations considered to be an imminent danger to life, expired early Wednesday morning, but officials said dangerous flooding remained even after the alert lapsed, with water rescues continuing. Indiana's flooding, meanwhile, escalated into its own statewide emergency. By August 13th, floodwaters in Henry County, Indiana, had risen high enough to reach the rooftops of some homes. In Cambridge City, a small Indiana town, video captured a man clinging to a utility pole in rushing floodwater as a rescue boat moved in to reach him. A resident of Cambridge City named Carly Fry, who had lived there since 2009, was evacuated from her own home by rescue boat. She described the moment to WRTV, the ABC affiliate in Indianapolis, saying she'd never seen the flooding get this severe in all her years living there. Streets in the county didn't just flood. In at least one case, A street actually collapsed under the force of the flash flooding, according to ABC News reporting. In response, Indiana's governor declared a statewide disaster emergency, a step beyond a county-level declaration, reflecting how widespread the damage had become across the state. Kentucky and West Virginia, while not the epicenter of the Derecho's damage, weren't spared either. Both states were included in the more than 700,000 customer power outage count reported across the region, and the level 3 of 5 flooding rainfall risk that the Weather Prediction Center issued, specifically named Charleston, West Virginia, alongside Cincinnati and Columbus, Ohio, and the eastern portions of Indianapolis, as areas facing the most serious flash flood danger. CNN's coverage of the event described flash flooding as possible in a stripe running all the way from Chicago to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., even as officials stressed that the most severe threat remained concentrated in the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians. That's a reminder that even though this story centers on the Midwest, the same storm system and the same flood risk pushed damage and danger well beyond the region's usual boundaries into the mid-Atlantic states as the week went on. And this is where the changed part of this story really comes into focus, because the danger isn't over, it's evolving. As of Thursday, August 13th, the same day floodwaters were still rising in parts of Indiana, the National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center in College Park, Maryland, issued an updated outlook describing an active pattern that would keep heavy rainfall and flash flooding in the forecast across much of the Midwest and into the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic through early the following week. In other words, this isn't a storm that passed through and left. It's a pattern that's stalled, cycling more rounds of heavy rain over ground that's already saturated from the previous rounds, which is exactly the setup that produces the most dangerous kind of flash flooding, because the water simply has nowhere left to go. Layered directly on top of that flood threat is something that, on its own, would already be a major story, a dangerous and prolonged heat wave. According to the National Weather Service, heat warnings have been posted for Wichita, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Paducah, Kentucky, with heat index values. Now, what the air actually feels like once humidity is factored in, reaching 111 degrees in St. Louis and 110 in Kansas City. Broader reporting on the pattern put the number of people at risk from dangerously high temperatures at roughly 80 million, spanning from California to the Northeast, with heat index values generally running between 95 and 110 degrees across the affected zone. NOAA's Weather Prediction Center described it as a broad, persistent upper-level ridge parked over the southern tier of the country, driving hazardous heat into the south-central United States and the southeast, with the most significant cumulative heat impact expected across the mid-Atlantic through Thursday and the eastern Ohio Valley through Friday. Here's why that combination, flooding to the north, extreme heat to the south, both stacked over the same general region, is what's actually changed for the millions of people living through it. A tornado outbreak, however devastating, tends to be violent but localized and brief. The danger passes through a corridor and then it's gone, and recovery, while painful, has a clear starting point. What the Midwest and Ohio Valley are facing this week doesn't behave that way. It's a compound, multi-day event, derecho-driven wind damage and power outages, followed immediately by flash flooding from rain falling on ground that's already full, arriving at the same time that an entirely separate heat dome is baking the region on its southern and western edge, straining a power grid that's already been knocked out for hundreds of thousands of people. For a family in Ohio or Indiana without electricity, that's not just an inconvenience. It means no air conditioning during dangerous heat, no way to pump water out of a flooded basement, and in some cases, no safe way for first responders to even reach them. That last point isn't speculation. It already cost at least one life. In Roseville, Ohio, first responders couldn't get to a resident having a medical emergency, specifically because the roads were flooded, according to Governor DeWine. That's the sharpest illustration of how these overlapping threats compound each other rather than simply adding up. Wind knocks out power and blocks roads with fallen trees. Flooding closes the roads that survive the wind. Heat raises the stakes for every hour that power stays out. Each hazard makes the others more dangerous and more difficult to respond to. It's also worth pointing out how this fits, or doesn't fit, into the broader shape of 2026's weather so far. Reporting from Fox Weather earlier in June had already flagged an unusually intense pattern developing over the Midwest, describing what meteorologists called a rare, synchronized setup of two distinct atmospheric mechanisms colliding over Illinois and Indiana, and noting that if the pattern held, 2026 stood a real chance of challenging the all-time full-month wind report record for June, which stands at 5,554 reports. That was 2 months before this week's Derecho, so this isn't a single freak event dropped into an otherwise ordinary year. It's the latest, and by some measures the most severe, entry in a season that had already been trending toward record territory since spring. Meteorologists have a specific term for the broader pattern that's been driving a lot of this: a ring of fire setup in which a dome of high pressure and heat sits over one part of the country, in this case, generally to the south, while storm systems repeatedly ride along its northern edge, one after another, like beads on a string. That's part of why the Midwest and Ohio Valley have seen so many rounds of severe weather compressed into such a short window this month. It's not one storm. It's a conveyor belt of storms, all following roughly the same track because the atmospheric setup keeps steering them that way, while the heat dome to the south stays locked in place and keeps intensifying on its own. Looking at where things stand as of this report, nearly 3 million people across Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri were under flood watches extending through Friday, according to reporting from 93.7 The River, which cited data on the severe weather threat facing the wider Ohio Valley region. The severe storm risk itself has been tracked using the Storm Prediction Center's standard 5-level scale, and this week's events reached a level 3 out of 5 on multiple days across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, categorized as an enhanced risk, one level below the most serious, moderate, and high categories the agency uses for the most extreme setups. Chicago, in particular, has functioned almost as ground zero for this entire stretch of extreme weather, and it's worth returning to the city specifically because of how much of this story has run directly through it. It was the origin point, or close to it, for the June 11th tornado outbreak that set records for the local National Weather Service office. It sat directly in the path of the August 11th derecho, with wind gusts of 80 to 90 miles per hour recorded across the metro area, and tornadoes touching down in its southern suburbs. Its airports shut down operations, even if briefly, as the storm rolled through. And, as of Thursday, August 13th, forecasters were warning of yet another threat for additional flash flooding in the Chicago region, running from Thursday afternoon through Friday morning, just days after the derecho, and while cleanup from the earlier flooding was still underway. Few cities in the country have absorbed as many distinct severe weather threats in as short a span this year as Chicago has. There's also an economic dimension to this week's derecho that tends to get less attention than the human toll, but matters enormously to the region: agriculture. The Midwest is often called the Corn Belt for a reason, and derechos have a well-documented history of devastating crops in a matter of minutes. The clearest comparison is the August 2020 derecho that tore through Iowa, which the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago have both since described as the costliest thunderstorm event in U.S. history, causing at least $11 billion in damage across the Midwest and flattening millions of acres of corn and soybeans, according to NOAA's own disaster tracking. Reporting from the Society of Environmental Journalists at the time noted that storm alone laid siege to more than 10 million acres of Iowa cropland, with up to 43% of the state's corn and soybean crop damaged. This week's derecho followed a similar track through parts of the Corn Belt, and agricultural outlets were already reporting the fallout within hours. AgWeb reported cornfields flattened across the storm's path, including near Columbus, Ohio, with growers now facing weeks of uncertainty over how much yield potential survives in fields hit by both damaging wind and heavy rain. That damage assessment is landing at an already sensitive moment for Midwest farmers. The U.S. Department of Agriculture had just cut its 2026 national corn yield estimate to 180, 7 bushels per acre, and its soybean estimate to 52, 7 bushels per acre in its latest crop production report, citing extreme heat and dryness that had already stressed crops in parts of the region before this week's storms even arrived. In other words, this derecho didn't hit a resilient, high-condition crop. It hit fields that were already under stress from the same heat pattern that's now baking the southern half of the region. Full financial damage estimates from this week's storm are still being compiled as of this report and hadn't yet been finalized by state agriculture departments or crop insurers, so those figures are genuinely still pending rather than confirmed. It's also worth understanding, in plain terms, why a heat dome and a flood threat can sit right next to each other on the same weather map without canceling each other out, because it seems counterintuitive until you see how the atmosphere is actually arranged this week. A heat dome forms when a large area of high pressure parks itself in the upper atmosphere and effectively traps warm air underneath it, like a lid on a pot, suppressing cloud formation and allowing temperatures to climb day after day with little relief. That's what NOAA's Weather Prediction Center described sitting over the south central and southeastern United States this week. Storm systems, meanwhile, generally can't push directly through a dome like that. They get steered around its northern edge instead, which is exactly why the heaviest rain, the derecho, and the flash flooding have all been concentrated across the northern tier of the affected region, in a band running roughly from the Dakotas and Nebraska through Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, while the dome itself bakes Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and the southeast under clear skies and dangerous heat. Both hazards are, in a sense, two sides of the same atmospheric coin this week, not two unrelated events that happen to overlap on a calendar. AccuWeather's meteorology team has a specific name for this exact setup, a ring of fire pattern, in which the center of a high-pressure ridge suppresses storms directly beneath it, while the atmospheric circulation around that high causes clusters of thunderstorms to drift clockwise along its rim. According to the Wikipedia entry on the phenomenon, which cites AccuWeather's own explainer on the subject, ring of fire setups are also commonly cited as contributing factors in warm season derecho specifically, because extreme atmospheric instability tends to build right along the edges of the ridge, which is precisely where this week's derecho formed and traveled. This also isn't the first time this particular pattern has caused serious damage in the region this year. A ring of fire setup in late June produced widespread flooding in Kentucky that killed at least 4 people, according to AccuWeather's own coverage from that week, as a heat dome parked over the central and eastern United States sent repeated clusters of storms cruising along its edge. That means the broad atmospheric pattern now driving this week's derecho, flash flooding, and heat wave isn't a one-off. It's a pattern that has already proven capable of producing fatal flooding once this summer, reforming and doing it again in a different part of the same general region less than 2 months later. Zooming out to the immediate forecast, AccuWeather's senior meteorologist Alex Sosnowski described the pattern in an updated forecast published Thursday. Rounds of severe thunderstorms were expected to continue moving from the plains into the Midwest, the Appalachians, and the Atlantic coast through the rest of the week, with damaging wind gusts and a significant risk of flash flooding, especially in places where storms repeatedly track over the same ground, a phenomenon meteorologists call training, because the storms line up and pass over one location again and again, like train cars on the same track. According to that AccuWeather analysis, a large area stretching from central Iowa to southwestern Pennsylvania and down into northeastern Tennessee was forecast to see an additional 2 to 4 inches of rain, on top of everything that's already fallen. By Thursday, the immediate aftermath of the derecho was still being measured in very concrete terms. Storm survey teams remained in the field confirming exact tornado counts and wind speeds, since, as is standard practice for events of this scale, official numbers get finalized over the following days and sometimes weeks, as National Weather Service meteorologists physically inspect damage patterns on the ground. So when you hear preliminary tornado counts for this week's derecho, understand that those are early estimates, not final numbers, and they may shift slightly once survey work wraps up. Similarly, while the confirmed death toll from this week's storms stood at a minimum of 4 as of the most recent reporting available, officials in multiple states cautioned that assessments were still ongoing and the number could still change as recovery work continues in the hardest hit areas. What makes this week genuinely different from the outbreaks that came before it in 2026 isn't necessarily the wind speed or the rainfall totals or even the tornado count. Plenty of individual numbers from March and April were larger. What's different is the shape of the threat itself. This wasn't a single afternoon of severe weather that Midwesterners could brace for, endure, and then begin recovering from. It was a rolling, multi-day, multi-hazard event, where a derecho's wind damage bled directly into flash flooding, which then bled directly into a heat emergency, all while power stayed out for hundreds of thousands of households across 5 or 6 states at once. For the millions of people living inside that overlap zone, from Des Moines to Chicago, to Indianapolis, to Columbus, to Charleston, West Virginia, the storm didn't really end when the wind died down. It just changed shape. Before wrapping up, it's worth being straightforward about where the picture is still incomplete. The exact death toll from this week's events has been reported differently by different outlets over a 48-hour window, as low as 2 in early coverage from the watchers, rising to at least 4 in later Associated Press and HNGN reporting, which most likely reflects the normal process of confirmation rather than any disagreement about what happened. The cause of the house explosion in Portage, Indiana, and whether it was directly triggered by the storm, remains under active investigation and has not been officially confirmed either way. And final tornado counts, wind speed measurements, and damage assessments from the August 11th derecho are still preliminary, pending full survey work from the National Weather Service. Everything else in this account of the timeline, the emergency declarations, the power outage figures, the rainfall totals, and the forecast through the coming days comes from named verifiable sources: the National Weather Service and its Storm Prediction Center and Weather Prediction Center, NOAA, the Associated Press, ABC News, CNN, AccuWeather, Weather.com, Fox Weather, and the Watcher's independent Severe Weather Desk. For homeowners across the affected states, the road back to normal is likely to stretch well beyond this week. Utility crews working through downed trees and snapped power lines across 5 or 6 states typically take days to fully restore power after a derecho of this scale, and past events offer a rough guide for what residents can expect. After the August 2020 Iowa derecho, which the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and NOAA both later ranked as the costliest thunderstorm on record, tens of thousands of Iowans remained without power more than a week after the storm passed, according to NASA's Earth Observatory. This week's event, while covering different ground, followed a similar script in its opening days. Rolling outages, blocked roads, and utility crews prioritizing hospitals, water treatment plants, and the most densely affected neighborhoods first, before working their way out to harder-to-reach rural areas. For families without power during a stretch that includes both flash flood risk and dangerous heat, that restoration timeline isn't a minor inconvenience. It's the difference between a manageable disruption and a genuinely dangerous week at home. So here's the real question worth sitting with. The Midwest has always lived with severe weather. That's not new, and residents there have generational experience handling tornadoes and blizzards alike. What seems to be shifting is the layering, wind, flood, and heat arriving together instead of one at a time, stretching emergency resources across multiple crises at once instead of just one. Do you think this kind of compound, multi-hazard, severe weather is becoming the new normal for the Midwest? Or is this simply an unusually intense stretch within a single, unusually active year? And if you're in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, or anywhere else along this pattern's path, how is this week actually compared to what you were expecting going into it? Let me know where you land on that, and what it's actually looked like where you are. That's where things stand right now, across a stretch of the country that covers roughly half a dozen states and tens of millions of people, all dealing with some combination of wind damage, floodwater, heat, or all three at once in the same week. Stay safe if you're anywhere in the path of this pattern, and we'll keep tracking it as more confirmed information comes in.